The morning Theodora Grayson drove her first stake into the cracked red earth of the Cimarron Flats, the banker's laughter was still ringing in her ears. She had ridden 12 miles on a borrowed mule to reach the offices of Harlan Bess at the First Territorial Bank of Colfax County, New Mexico, in the spring of 1878, with her husband's death certificate folded in her coat pocket and a surveyor's map pressed flat against her chest. She had dressed carefully that morning, choosing the dark wool dress with the ivory collar, the one she had worn to her wedding 6 years prior, because she believed that a woman walking into a bank to discuss serious matters of land and credit ought to look as though she understood the weight of both. She had braided her chestnut hair tight and pinned it back and sat across from Harlan Bess with her hands folded in her lap and her chin level and her brown eyes clear. Harlan Bess was a man built like a barrel left too long in the sun, soft in the middle and hardened around the edges, and he had the particular brand of condescension that small, powerful men in small, powerful positions tend to acquire over years of practice. He had listened to Theodora speak about the 40 acres her late husband, Robert Grayson, had purchased 2 years before his death from a fever in the autumn of 1877. He had listened to her describe the soil composition she had read about in an agricultural pamphlet from the Kansas Farmers Cooperative. He had listened to her explain that she intended to plant corn on the lower 40, where a seasonal creek ran through the property in late spring, and that she needed a small operating loan of $60 to purchase seed, tools, and a mule of her own. Then Harlan Bess had leaned back in his leather chair and laughed. Not a small laugh, either. The kind that involves the whole chest and causes a man's face to go red and his eyes to water, as though the funniest thing he had heard all decade had just been delivered to him personally. He had called in his clerk from the outer room, a young man named Clifton with ink-stained fingers, and repeated what Theodora had said, and Clifton had offered a polite, uncertain smile that managed to convey both embarrassment on her behalf and allegiance to his employer. "Mrs. Grayson," Bess had finally said, pressing a handkerchief to his eyes, "that land your husband bought is alkali-contaminated, rock-hard, and sits on the wrong side of the water table for any serious agricultural purpose. The man who sold it to Robert, God rest him, knew exactly what he was doing. That land is worthless. The bank has no interest in financing a widow's daydream." Theodora had stood up. She had folded the surveyor's map back against her chest. She had said, with a steadiness that cost her considerably more than she let show, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Bess." And she had walked out of the bank into the white New Mexico sunlight and stood on the plank sidewalk and breathed for a long moment before she mounted the borrowed mule and rode the 12 miles back. She had cried exactly once, somewhere around the 7th mile, when the land opened up wide and flat and there was no one to see her, and then she had stopped, and by the time she arrived back at the 40 acres, she had made up her mind. She would plant the corn herself. She had $43 saved from the sale of Robert's horse and tools, the ones she didn't need. She spent 11 of them on seed corn from a trading post in Rayado, choosing the variety called Bloody Butcher, because the trader told her it was drought-tolerant and could push roots deep into resistant soil. She spent another $6 on a second-hand plow, iron-headed and sound, and borrowed a neighbor's draft horse for the turning of the earth, with the understanding that she would give the neighbor's wife 2 jars of preserves from her cellar. The rest of the money she kept hidden in a coffee tin beneath the floorboard under her bed, because Robert had always said a person ought to keep something in reserve, and Robert had been right about most practical things, even if the fever had taken him before he could put his wisdom to more use. The land was difficult. The bank had not been entirely wrong about that. The soil on the upper portion of the 40 acres was pale and alkaline, and it resisted the plow like something offended by the intrusion. But the lower section, the 12 acres that sloped gently toward the seasonal creek bed, was darker and richer, and when Theodora dug her hands into it on her knees in the early April morning, She could feel the moisture that lived deeper down, the water that hadn't yet reached the surface but was moving toward it. She had read about dry farming methods in the pamphlet from Kansas. She had read about hilling corn to retain moisture, and about planting in rows aligned to catch the prevailing wind, and about adding manure worked deep before sowing. She did not have unlimited manure, or unlimited time, or unlimited strength, but she had all three in the amounts that mattered, and she began. She was working on the third day of planting, the morning sun not yet fully free of the eastern ridge, when she first noticed the man watching her from the fence line. He was leaning against a post at the far edge of his property, which ran along the northern border of Theodora's 40 acres, separated by a low split-rail fence that Robert had put up with help from a traveling hand the summer before his death. The man was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark hat pulled low, and he was watching her work the plow across the creekside field with an expression she couldn't fully read from 40 yards. Not mockery. Not the flat disinterest of a man who had places to be and considered her work irrelevant. Something more considered than either of those. She stopped and straightened and shaded her eyes with her hand and looked at him directly. He didn't look away. He tipped his hat, a single small motion, and then turned and walked back through his own field toward the long, low house that sat near the center of his property. Theodora had heard his name, Phineas Turner. He ran cattle on the 320 acres that bordered her land to the north and the west, a modest operation by the standards of the larger ranches in the county, but well maintained by all accounts. He had bought the land 4 years prior from an older rancher who had moved his family east, and in the 2 years that Theodora had lived on the adjacent property with Robert, she had spoken to Phineas Turner exactly twice. Once at the general store in Cimarron, where they had both reached for the same bolt of heavy canvas at the same moment and laughed briefly and apologized simultaneously, and once at the autumn community gathering at the Presbyterian church, where he had greeted Robert with a handshake and her with a nod, and said perhaps 12 words across the entire evening. He was known, as far as she had gathered from the women of the town, as a man who kept to himself. Not unfriendly, not cold, just quiet in a way that some people found restful and others found unnerving. He had no wife. He had 2 hired hands, brothers named Cal and Emmett Marsh, who did most of the visible social interacting that ranch life required. He was perhaps 34 or 35, she guessed, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that had been made angular by years of weather and work. She did not think much more about Phineas Turner that morning. She had corn to plant. The weeks that followed were the hardest work Theodora had ever done in her life, and she had not lived a soft life. She had grown up on a farm in eastern Missouri, the second of 5 children, and had understood manual labor since she was old enough to carry a bucket. But farming on someone else's land with her father's direction was different from farming her own land alone, and the 40 acres asked things of her body that she did not always feel she had to give. She rose before sunrise every morning and was in the field as the sky went from black to deep blue to the pale gold of early day. She worked until the heat of midday made the air shimmer and the soil too hot to work productively, and then she rested for 2 hours in the shade of the small house, eating whatever simple meal she had prepared the evening before, and then she went back out until the light failed. The corn began to come up in the 2nd week of May. Small, tentative green shoots pushing through the red-brown soil in the rows she had prepared. She stood at the edge of the field the morning she first saw them, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since Robert's funeral. It was 3 days after the first shoots appeared that Phineas Turner came to her fence. She saw him coming across his own field from a distance, walking with the unhurried gait of a man who had decided to do something and was doing it without drama. He was carrying something. As he drew closer, she could see it was a wooden crate, not large, and when he reached the fence he set it on top of a post and lifted his hat briefly in greeting. "Mrs. Grayson," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, deliberate in the way some quiet men's voices are, each word placed carefully. "Mr. Turner," she said, setting down her hoe and walking over. Up close, she could see that the crate held several items: a coil of thin rope, a bundle of wooden stakes, and a glass bottle with a paper label she recognized as sulfur dust, used for treating soil with fungal problems. "I noticed your rows are running east-west," he said. "On this slope, north-south rows will hold water better when the creek floods in June. The ground channels down that way." He gestured along the slope with one hand, a simple explanatory motion. Theodora looked at her rows. She had laid them east-west because the pamphlet had said to align with the prevailing wind, which came from the west. "The pamphlet I read suggested wind alignment," she said carefully. "Pamphlets right for flat land," he said, "but this slope has got a slight grade. Water from the creek will follow gravity north before it follows wind. You'll lose half your moisture to runoff in your current alignment." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the rows, then back at him. He was not being condescending. His voice held none of Harlan Bess's amusement. He was simply telling her a fact he knew and she didn't, in the way that useful people do. "I'd have to pull the early shoots and re-row," she said. "They're small enough still that they'd survive it with care," he said. "Another week and it'd be too late." Theodora was not a woman who resisted good information out of pride. Pride had its place, but this was corn. She looked at him levelly. "Is there a reason you're choosing to tell me this, Mr. Turner?" Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of a fair question. "Because it'd be a waste of good work to lose the crop to something fixable," he said simply. She studied him for a moment longer, then she nodded. "Thank you, I'll pull and re-row today." He nodded back and picked up the crate again. "The sulfur is for the pale patches in the northeast corner. Soil there has a fungal crust that'll choke roots. Work it in before you replant that section." He set the crate on her side of the fence and walked back toward his land without further ceremony. Theodora looked at the crate for a long moment. Then she picked it up and carried it to the house, and came back out with a clean flour sack to kneel in and began the careful work of lifting the small corn shoots from the wrong rows. It took her 2 full days to re-row the 12 acres, working with the gentleness the small plants required. And when she was done, and the rows ran north-south down the slope, and the sulfur had been worked into the northeast corner, and she stood back and looked at the field in the late afternoon light, she felt in her bones that it was right. She saw Phineas Turner at the fence again the following week, this time not carrying anything, just standing with his arms folded on the top rail in the early evening and looking out across his own cattle. She walked over. "They took the transplant well," she said, meaning the corn. He glanced over at her field. "Good strong variety you chose." "Bloody butcher," she said. "The trader in Rayado said it was drought-tolerant." He was right. It'll want water in the tassel stage. About 6 weeks out. He paused. "The creek runs well into July most years. If it's a dry year, the lower section could get tight." "I have a plan for that," she said, though in truth her plan was incomplete and she knew it. He didn't press her on the plan, which she appreciated. They stood for a moment in companionable quiet, which was not uncomfortable. The evening light was going orange and long across the flats, and the cattle moved slowly in Phineas Turner's western field, and somewhere out toward the ridge a coyote called once and went silent. "Robert bought this land from Ellis Prout," she said, not sure why she said it. "I know," Phineas said. "Prout knew what he was doing. Ellis is good at finding people who haven't had time to have the land surveyed properly." "Did you know it was alkali when Robert bought it?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, considering. "I knew the upper portion was. The lower section I wasn't certain about until I watched how the spring water ran this year. And now you're certain." "I am," he said. Theodora looked out at her corn. "The bank told me it was worthless." Phineas Turner turned his head and looked at her then directly with an attention that was not idle. "Land is rarely worthless if you understand what it wants," he said. "The bank doesn't farm." The simplicity of it landed in her with a weight she hadn't expected. "No," she said, "it does not." She went back to the house and lay in her bed that night, and listened to the wind coming off the ridge and thought about the word worthless, and how Harlan Bess had said it, and how Phineas Turner had said what he said, and how different the air in both conversations had been. June came with its particular brand of New Mexico ferocity, a blue sky so deep and permanent it seemed enameled, and a heat that settled on the land like a weighted blanket by mid-morning. The corn grew with a speed and eagerness that Theodora found almost emotionally affecting. Each morning she walked the rows in the early light and measured the progress with her eye, the leaves broadening, the stalks thickening, the deep green color deepening. The creek ran as Phineas had predicted, a thin but reliable flow that she directed to the field using a simple gravity channel she dug herself, a shallow trench that required 3 days of work with a spade and her own stubborn determination. When she had finished and the water ran cleanly down the channel and spread into the field in exactly the way she had hoped, she sat down on the bank of the trench and laughed out loud, alone in the evening field, the kind of laugh that is also partly tears. Phineas found her there not by design but because he was checking his own fence line and the sound carried. He stopped at a respectful distance and she looked up and saw him, and the laugh tears were still on her face, and she did not quite manage to compose herself fully before he saw them. He did not pretend he had not seen. He did not make it awkward. He simply said, "The channel looks good," looking at the trench with genuine assessment. "It works," she said, standing up and wiping her face with the back of her hand with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who was not going to apologize for having felt something. "I've got the lumber for a proper sluice gate if you want to control flow better," he said. "It's extra from my barn repair, won't cost you anything." She looked at him. "Mr. Turner, you have already given me sulfur dust and fence stakes and practical advice that likely saved my crop. I don't want to be a charity case." The look he turned on her then was different from his usual careful neutrality. Something sharper and warmer lived in it. "It isn't charity," he said. "I've been watching this field for 2 weeks. What you're doing here is real farming, and it deserves to work. I'd hate to see it fail for want of a sluice gate that's sitting in my barn doing nothing." He paused. "I don't think you're a charity case. I think you're a farmer." The word farmer, said with that plainness, hit her somewhere deep and true. "All right," she said. "I accept the sluice gate." He came over the following afternoon with the lumber and tools, and they worked together to install it, him doing the heavy placement and her directing the angle because she knew the water flow better. And by evening it was in and controlling the irrigation channel with a simple lever mechanism that she could operate herself. They worked in a manner that felt natural to both of them without excessive talk, reading each other's cues in the way that people do when they are both skilled with their hands and comfortable with silence. When it was done and the water ran perfectly controlled through the channel and into the field, they stood back and looked at it together. "You should eat something," he said, which was not what she expected him to say. She looked at him. "I noticed you haven't stopped since mid-morning," he said, not accusatory. "Just observational. I could say the same about you. I ate this morning. So did I." He looked at her with a level expression that communicated he did not find this entirely convincing. She laughed, a smaller, more controlled laugh than the earlier one. "I have bread and salt pork inside. You're welcome to share it if you like." He hesitated, and she could see the hesitation, and she recognized it as the hesitation of a private man considering whether sharing a simple meal was a thing he was prepared to do. "All right," he said. They ate at her small kitchen table in the last light coming through the west window, and the conversation was uncomplicated and honest. She told him about the pamphlet and the bank and Harlan Bess's laughter, and he listened with his full attention without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Bess has done that to others," he said. "He held loans on 2 farms east of here that he called in early. Both families lost their properties." "He wanted mine," she said. It was not a guess. She had pieced it together over weeks of thinking. "Most likely," Phineas said. "There are men in this county who make their money by identifying land that looks bad from the outside and arranging for it to fail faster. Then they buy it at loss price and develop it properly." Except this land is actually going to grow corn, Theodora said. Yes, he said. It is. They looked at each other across the table in the warm evening light, and something shifted between them, subtle as the turn of water when it finds a new channel. Theodora felt it and did not name it, because there were things she was not ready to name yet. Robert had been gone less than a year. She had grief still living in her, not the sharp, raw kind anymore, but the deep-seated, permanent kind that becomes part of the architecture of a person. But she noticed the shift. She was an honest woman, and she noticed it. Phineas Turner ate his bread and salt pork with quiet appreciation, and helped her carry the tools back to the linta behind the house without being asked, and thanked her for the meal with a sincerity that was not performative, and walked back across his field in the dusk. She watched him go from the doorway for a moment, and then went inside and washed the plates. The trouble came in early July, as trouble in that part of New Mexico had a way of doing. 3 men rode onto her property on a Thursday morning when the corn was standing 4 feet tall and beginning to show the first pale silk of tassel, a sight that Theodora had looked at each morning with a satisfaction she could not entirely find words for. She was working in the near field mending a fence post when she heard the horses, and she stood and turned and watched them come. She recognized one of them. Clifton, the bank clerk, now sitting on a horse with a bit more authority than he had previously projected and carrying a paper in his hand. The other 2 were men she did not know, broad and watchable in the way that men who are paid to make things happen are watchable. Mrs. Grayson, Clifton said, drawing up and looking down at her. He had the decency, at least, to look mildly uncomfortable. Clifton, she said. He extended the paper. Mr. Bess has asked me to deliver this formal notice. The property taxes on this land are 9 months overdue. The bank has acquired the tax lien from the county and is notifying you that foreclosure proceedings will begin in 30 days if the sum of $18.40 is not paid in full. Theodora took the paper. She read it carefully. She read it a second time. Robert paid the taxes current through last November, she said. The payment date for the next term is September. Clifton cleared his throat. Mr. Bess has documentation indicating the November payment was not credited. Because it was paid at the county clerk's office, not at the bank, she said. I have Robert's receipt. There was a flicker of something in Clifton's face, not malice, discomfort. He was doing a thing he knew was wrong, and he was not fully comfortable with it and not quite courageous enough to stop. The notice stands, ma'am, he said. 30 days, $18.40. They rode away. Theodora stood in her 4-foot corn and looked at the paper in her hand and felt the familiar cold anger that she had learned to use as fuel rather than allow to use her. She had the money. Barely. The coffee tin under the floorboard held $31. 18 of them to Harlan Bess would leave her 13, and there was still the fall to get through before any corn money came in, and a dozen things that $13 would not fully cover. But she had the money, and she had the receipt, and she was going to fight this properly. She was on her way back to the house to retrieve the receipt when she nearly walked into Phineas Turner at her fence. He had seen the men ride in from his field, and he had walked over. He was reading her expression rather than her face, she thought, the way people who are practiced observers do. Bank men, she said. I recognized Clifton, he said. She told him what the notice said. He listened. Robert's tax receipt, he said when she finished. I have it. I need to ride to the county clerk in Cimarron and have it verified. The county clerk is Thomas Harker, Phineas said. He and Bess are fraternal lodge brothers. She stared at him. Of course they are. The Territorial Land Office in Taos would have an independent record, he said. It's a 2-day ride. I cannot leave the corn unattended for 2 days, she said. There was a pause. Then Cal and Emmett can watch the field. They're good men, and I'll ride with you. The offer landed with a weight she felt in her chest. You would ride to Taos with me, she said. I know the Territorial Land Office registrar, man named Valdez. He's honest. He said it without elaboration as a simple fact. Mr. Turner, she said carefully, why are you helping me this much? He was quiet for a moment, and it was the kind of quiet that meant the answer was genuine and was being considered properly rather than deflected. "Because what Bess is doing is wrong," he said. "And because your corn is going to come in, and it would be a shame for that not to happen." He paused, and then he added more quietly, "And because I would have said something about the tax situation before now if I had known about it, and I didn't. So this is partly that." She looked at him for a long moment. The July heat was already building, and the light on the corn was gold and green, and the whole 40 acres smelled of warm growing things, and somewhere in that moment, Theodora Grayson understood that she trusted this man. Not because he had been helpful, though he had, but because his helpfulness came from somewhere honest and uncalculated, and she had known enough calculating people to recognize the difference. "We should leave tomorrow morning," she said. "Early." "I'll have the horses ready at first light," he said. They left before sunrise, Theodora on her own mule and Phineas on a solid bay gelding named Cooper, riding north and west on the road toward Taos with the night still faintly in the sky above them, and the land going from black to gray to gold as they rode. Cal and Emmett Marsh had been instructed on the irrigation channel and the field schedule, and Cal, who was the older and more serious of the two brothers, had listened carefully and asked intelligent questions that reassured Theodora enough that she could leave. The ride to Taos took a full day, arriving in the late afternoon of the first day. They stayed at a boarding house on the main street, separate rooms, Theodora paying for her own, because she was a specific kind of woman about specific kinds of things, and Phineas did not argue with her about it. At dinner at the boarding house table, with several other travelers and a talkative family from Missouri passing through on their way to Arizona, Theodora and Phineas sat across from each other and ate roast chicken and talked in the particular private way that two people talk when they are surrounded by others, and the conversation is meant only for each other. He told her about the Territorial Land Office and what to say to register Valdez, and she listened and asked the right questions, and somewhere in the middle of dinner, she realized that she had not thought about Robert for the first time in a day without it feeling like a betrayal. She turned the realization over carefully in her mind, like a stone turned to see what lives beneath it, and found that underneath it was not guilt, exactly, but something more tender and uncertain. She put it aside for now. There was work to do tomorrow. The Territorial Land Office opened at 8 in the morning. Ramon Valdez was a compact and careful man in his early 50s who wore spectacles and kept his records in an orderly system that spoke well of him professionally. Phineas greeted him with a handshake and a familiar nod, and Valdez recognized him with visible pleasure, and the three of them sat down, and Theodora laid out Robert's tax receipt and the foreclosure notice, and explained the situation with a precision she had rehearsed in her head during the ride. Valdez went into his records. He was thorough and unhurried, and it took the better part of an hour, but when he came back, he had the county record and it was clear. Robert Grayson had paid his taxes through the November term at the county clerk's office. The payment was recorded in the territorial ledger. There was no lien. The bank's claim was fraudulent. Valdez wrote a certified letter on official territorial letterhead, signed and stamped, affirming the payment record and nullifying the claimed lien. He also, without being asked, wrote a note to the territorial inspector's office flagging the discrepancy for investigation, because Ramon Valdez was a man of genuine integrity, and he understood what Harlan Bess was. Theodora held the certified letter in both hands in the morning light outside the land office and looked at it for a long moment. "Well," she said. Phineas stood beside her. He had not said much inside, letting her conduct the business herself, which she had noticed and appreciated. "Well," he agreed. She looked up at him. The sun was coming over the buildings to the east, and it caught the silver at his temples and the clean, direct line of his jaw, and she thought, with the clarity of a person who is trying not to think something, that he was a genuinely good-looking man. She had thought it before in a distant, objective way. But standing here with the letter that saved her land in her hands and him beside her, It was less distant than it had previously been. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that was too full for a single simple phrase, but she did not have better words available at the moment, and she was not a woman who spoke more than she meant. He nodded. Something in his eyes when they met hers was warm and direct in a way she hadn't quite seen in him before. He had been kind and practical, and she had felt his concern for her situation like a steady warmth. But this was something slightly different, a bit more personal. She felt it, and he saw that she felt it, and they both looked away at roughly the same moment. And she thought that was probably wise. They rode back the same day they had come, wanting to make it back to the land before full dark, and they made good time. The horses were willing, and the road was clear, and the late afternoon desert light was extraordinary, the whole landscape turning rose and amber and that particular deep violet that happened in the west just before the last of the day went down. They talked more on the return ride, not about the bank or the land or the corn, about other things. She told him about Missouri and her family, the farm where she had grown up, the 2 brothers and 2 sisters. He told her about where he had come from, which was Kansas, originally, and before that Indiana, following work west in the way that men of his generation did, learning cattle management from an older rancher he had worked for near Wichita before saving enough to buy his own land. She asked him why he had stayed quiet so long when they had been neighbors for 2 years. He thought about this for a moment, and then he said, "You and Robert seemed settled and sufficient to each other." It didn't feel like my place to intrude on that. The honesty of it caught her. She had not thought about what their marriage had looked like from the outside. "We were," she said quietly. "Sufficient to each other." A pause. "He was a good man." "He seemed to be," Phineas said, and the respect in his voice was genuine. They arrived back at the property in the full dark, and Cal had kept the lantern burning at the fence, and the corn stood in its rows undisturbed, and Theodora walked the edge of the field in the lantern light just to see it, just to feel the relief of it still being there and still being hers. She delivered the certified letter personally to the county clerk's office in Cimarron the following morning, with Phineas riding alongside. Thomas Harker, the county clerk and Harlan Bess's lodge brother, received it with a face that went through several colors before settling on a kind of gray resignation. A copy was sent to the territorial inspector's office, as Valdez had already arranged. The lien was officially dissolved. Harlan Bess's foreclosure notice was null. 2 weeks after that, a letter arrived from the territorial inspector's office informing Theodora that a formal inquiry had been opened into the First Territorial Bank of Colfax County regarding predatory lien practices. She read the letter 3 times and then folded it carefully and put it in the same cedar box where she kept Robert's death certificate and his letters and the surveyor's map of the 40 acres. The corn continued to grow. July became August, and August in New Mexico was its own particular animal, hot and still in the mornings and prone to afternoon thunderstorms that came up from the south with dramatic speed and dumped their contents on the land in an hour, and then left the air smelling of wet clay and sage. Theodora loved those storms. She would stand in the doorway of the small house and watch them come across the flats, the wall of dark cloud and the curtain of rain sweeping toward her, and feel something close to joy at the water they were bringing to her field. Phineas came to her fence most evenings now, not always with something to say, sometimes just leaning on the top rail and watching the sunset, and she would come out and lean on her side, and they would watch it together. They talked more freely now than they had in the beginning. She had learned that he was 36, 2 years older than her 34, and that he read more than most people expected, keeping a small shelf of books in his house that included a worn copy of Thoreau and a natural history of the North American plains that he had read 3 times. She had laughed at the Thoreau, and he had looked at her with a measured expression and said, "You haven't read it," and she had said, "I've read parts," and he had brought the book over the following day without comment and left it on her fence post. She read it in the evenings after field work, sitting in the single chair by the window with the lamp lit, and found that she understood why he kept it. There was something in it about the relationship between a person and the land they lived on that felt true to the experience of this particular summer in a way that surprised her. She told him so the next evening. He looked at her with an expression that was, for him, openly pleased. Not a smile exactly, but a warmth around the eyes that she had come to recognize as his equivalent of it. Especially the parts about deliberate living, she said. The whole enterprise of this field is deliberate living, he said. She looked out at the corn, which was now over 6 feet tall and producing full ears wrapped in their green husks, the silk gone from pale gold to brown, which was the sign of pollination and eventual ripeness. The bank called it worthless, she said. People call things worthless when they can't see the value, he said. Usually it means the value is there, but they lack the patience or the knowledge to find it. She turned and looked at him fully then, because she was beginning to understand that he said things that meant more than one thing at once, and this felt like one of those moments. He was looking at the corn. But she thought he was perhaps also saying something about herself, about what the bank and people like Harlan Bess had decided about a widow farming alone on ground they had written off. And she thought perhaps there was a third thing he was gesturing toward between the two of them which was still too new and unspoken to be named. Phineas, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. He turned and looked at her. "Why didn't you buy this land?" she said. "When Ellis Prout was selling it, it borders your property. Most ranchers in your position would have bought it." He considered this. "I could see what the lower section had potential for," he said, "but I run cattle, not crops. I don't have the knowledge or the patience for proper farming, and I think land should be worked by the people who understand it." A pause. "And when Robert Grayson bought it, he seemed like a man with plans for it. It felt right to let it go to him." "Did you know the lower section had agricultural potential when he bought it?" A slight pause. "I suspected." She looked at him steadily. "You could have warned him about Prout." "I should have," he said, and the weight of genuine regret in those 3 words was not small. "I didn't know Robert well enough then to presume." I learned over the next year that he was a straightforward man who would have wanted to know, and by then the purchase was done and I didn't see the point in distressing him about it. She thought about this for a long moment. "I'm not angry with you," she said. "I'm telling you that I notice things and I want to know the truth of them." "Yes," he said. "That's clear about you, and it was not a criticism. It was, if anything, a kind of admiration." She went inside and let the evening settle around her, and thought about a man who regretted a missed moment of openness, and was making up for it now in every small, deliberate way he had available to him. The corn came ready in late September, a harvest that Theodora had not allowed herself to fully imagine until she was standing in the field with the first ripe ear in her hand, pulling back the husk to find the tight-packed kernels of deep red bloody butcher corn, and the sight of it made her close her eyes and breathe for a moment in a silence that was almost prayer. The yield from the 12 productive acres was substantial. Not a commercial farmer's dream harvest, but for a first-year crop on land that a bank had declared worthless, done by a single woman with limited tools and significant opposition, it was remarkable. She had 37 bushels to sell and enough to keep for winter seed and winter eating. The trading post in Rayado bought 15 bushels at 50 cents a bushel. A family homesteading east of Cimarron bought 10 more. A mill outside of town took the remaining 12 at 45 cents. When she had added the coins and the bills and set them on the kitchen table and counted twice, she had $19.60, which when combined with what remained of the coffee tin came to $29 total. She sat at the table and looked at the money for a long time. It was not wealth. It was not even comfortable. But it was the product of her own knowledge and her own labor on land that had been called worthless, and it was real, and it was hers. She went out to the fence the next evening with the intention of telling Phineas about the final yield numbers, because she told him most things now she had discovered, and she could not quite recall when that had become true. He was already there, leaning on the rail, watching the afterglow on the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east, and she came and leaned beside him and told him the numbers. He listened with his full attention, and at the end of it he was quiet for a moment. "You should go back to the bank," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "To Bess, with those numbers." There was something in his voice that she recognized as restrained satisfaction. Not to borrow money, just to let him see them. She thought about this. Then she laughed, a real full laugh that went out into the evening air and startled a bird off a nearby post. "Mr. Harlan Bess," she said, "is currently under investigation by the Territorial Inspector's Office for predatory practices." "I know," Phineas said. "Which is why letting him see a yield statement from the land he called worthless seems particularly appropriate right now." She laughed again, and he was watching her laugh with that warm expression around his eyes, and in the golden evening light she thought she had never been as happy in this particular way. A happiness made of hard work and real results, and a person beside her who understood the exact substance and weight of what had been accomplished. She turned toward him, and he was looking at her, and they were standing very close at the fence rail, and the moment had a quality to it, a fullness, like a breath held. She said, "I think I would like to go for a ride tomorrow, not toward Cimarron and not on business, just out toward the ridge in the morning." He looked at her for a moment with that careful attention of his, reading the thing beneath the words with the accuracy she had come to expect from him. "I'll bring the bay," he said, "and the roan for you if you don't want the mule." "I'd prefer the roan," she said. She went inside and lay awake for a while listening to the night wind come off the mountains and thinking about deliberate living, and about the way a person could plant something in ground that others had written off and watch it come up strong and real and entirely hers. The morning ride to the ridge was one of the finest mornings Theodora could remember, and she had had some fine mornings in her life. They rode out before the full heat of the day, through the scrub oak and juniper on the slope, the horses picking their way with easy confidence, and the world smelled of dry earth and cedar, and the faint sweetness of the late-blooming rabbit brush that dotted the hillside in yellow clusters. They did not talk much for the first part of the ride. The landscape asked for silence, and they were both people who understood that. But somewhere on the upper slope, where the trail leveled and they rode side by side on a clear path with the whole of the Cimarron Valley laid out below them, pale and vast and beautiful in the morning light, she spoke. "I've been thinking about next year's planting," she said. "The upper acres," he said, which told her he had been thinking about it too. "If I amend the alkaline section with lime and worked manure over the winter, the upper 15 could be viable by spring," she said. "I'd want to run a test row first. There's a lime deposit about 6 miles north on the property of an old Mexican farmer named Sebastiano Vargas. He sells it by the cartload, reasonable price." "You know the land here very well," she said. "4 years is long enough," he said. She looked out over the valley. The 40 acres was visible from here, a small rectangle of worked earth. The corn had been harvested and the stalks were turned back into the soil, and from this distance it looked modest and unremarkable, which she found she did not mind. She knew what it had produced. The land knew it too, in the way that land knows things in the composition of its worked and fed soil. "Robert always said he was going to make something of that land," she said. "He had ideas. He just ran out of time." Phineas was quiet. "I think he would have been glad to see the corn come in," she said. "He was a practical man. He appreciated things that worked." "So do you," Phineas said. "So do I." She paused. "I've been here 18 months now. Most of that time I've been too busy and too focused to feel the absence very sharply. But lately I feel it differently, not as the sharp thing it was, more like something I carry that has found its proper weight." She was not sure why she was telling him this, but she was a woman who believed in saying true things to people she trusted, and she trusted him. He did not say anything immediately, and she did not want him to. Some things needed to be received without the quick filling of silence. They sat on their horses on the ridge for a while. Below them, The valley went about its slow afternoon business, clouds throwing their shadows across the flats like great unhurried migrations. Then he said, "I've been alone a long time, not unhappily most of it, but differently than this." He did not explain what he meant by this, but she understood him to mean the summer, the fence-line evenings, the conversation, the work done alongside each other, the quality of being known by someone and knowing them back. "Yes," she said, "differently than this." They looked at each other in the high, clear air of the ridge, and something that had been building all summer settled into place between them, with a quiet certainty that neither of them needed to be loud about. He did not reach for her hand, and she did not reach for his, because they were both people who moved carefully and meant what they did. But the look between them was its own kind of reaching, and they both understood it. They rode back down in the afternoon, and he walked her to her door, which he had never done before, and on the porch step she turned and looked at him with the directness that was natural to her. "I would like you to come to dinner," she said. "Not bread and salt pork this time. A proper meal." Sunday evening. He looked at her with that warmth around his eyes. "I'll be here," he said he was. He arrived at Sunday's dusk with his hair combed and his good jacket on, which she noticed and appreciated, not for vanity's sake, but because it told her he had thought about coming and had wanted it to feel like a proper occasion. She had cooked a stew of venison and root vegetables, the venison provided by Cal Marsh, who hunted regularly and shared his surplus with neighbors, and she had made cornbread from the bloody butcher corn, which seemed right. They sat at the kitchen table by lamplight and ate, and talked in the full way of people who had months of context and trust behind them. He told her about his early years in Kansas, the ranch work and the savings, and the slow, deliberate process of becoming a man with land of his own. She told him about her father's farm in Missouri, and the way farming had lived in her as a kind of native language, something she had always known and been separated from by circumstance, and that the last year had allowed her to come back to. After the meal they sat for a while with cups of the chicory coffee she kept in place of the real thing, which was expensive, and the conversation went quieter, not finished but resting, and the lamplight was warm on the small room. "Or corn," he said, and then stopped as though looking for the right words, which was not common for him. "What you did this summer, with no support from the bank, with active opposition on ground that was supposed to fail. I want you to know I found it one of the most remarkable things I've seen." She looked at him carefully. "You're not saying that to flatter me." "I don't flatter people," he said with the mild certainty of a man stating a known fact about himself. "No," she said. "You don't." She paused. "Thank you, Phineas." The sound of his name in her mouth, said with that quiet warmth, was something neither of them looked away from this time. "Theodora," he said, and her name in his voice was a kind of pronouncement, careful and sure. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just laying it there, warm and still, not grasping or demanding, just present. She turned her hand over beneath his so that they were palm to palm. They sat like that for a while in the lamplight. She was not crying, and she did not laugh this time. She felt instead something that was very still and very real, like the feeling of placing a stake in ground and finding the earth solid beneath it. October came in on the back of the first real cold, frosts at night that turned the remaining grasses silver by morning. Theodora spent the month preparing the field for winter, working the harvested corn stalks and manure into the soil, ordering her first cartload of lime from Sebastiano Vargas, and having it delivered and spread across the upper alkaline section, with the intent of working it in through the freeze-thaw cycles of winter, so that the spring soil would be ready for a wider planting. She and Phineas had fallen into a natural rhythm that was easy to recognize from the outside, even if neither of them had put words to it yet. He came to dinner on Sundays. She walked to his fence line most evenings. They worked alongside each other on various shared projects, the repair of a section of fence that bordered both their properties, the building of a proper storage shed for her seed corn, the maintenance of the irrigation channel for the winter. The Marsh brothers had accepted the new arrangement with the simple good nature of men who liked their employer to be happy. One afternoon in mid-October, while they were working on the storage shed, Emmett Marsh had said to his brother in what he thought was a quiet voice, and was not quite, "Reckon there's going to be a wedding before spring." And Cal had said, "Hush." And there had been a brief silence, and Phineas had continued nailing planks without changing his expression. But Theodora had felt a heat in her face that she attended to by looking very intently at the corner post she was steadying. She thought about the word wedding on her walk home that evening, and then continued to think about it in the evenings that followed, turning it over with the same careful honesty she brought to all important things. She had loved Robert. He had been her first love, a solid and gentle man who had treated her with consistent respect and shared her belief in working hard toward things worth having. She did not love his memory less for what was growing between her and Phineas, but she understood that grief and new love were not opposites and did not cancel each other, and that a living heart was entitled to its living feelings. What she felt for Phineas Turner was different from what she had felt for Robert, not in degree but in character. It was quieter in some ways and sharper in others. It was built on a foundation of mutual understanding that had been constructed through observation and honest communication over months of working close to each other. And it had the particular quality of trust between two people who had seen each other at practical difficulty and responded with respect. She knew that she was in love with him. She had known it for several weeks, actually, with the clear-eyed self-knowledge that was her particular attribute. She was less certain about the proper moment to say so, because she was also a woman who understood that there was a right time for things, and that forcing a moment before it was ready was as counterproductive as planting before the last frost. The moment arrived in November, on a clear, cold evening when the mountains were dusted with their first snow, and the air smelled of wood smoke from both their chimneys, and the sky was so full of stars it seemed structural, as though the whole dome of the night was held up by light. They were at the fence, their usual place, but standing closer than usual because of the cold, not quite touching but within the reach of each other's warmth. She was wearing her heavy wool coat, and her breath made small clouds in the still air. "I'm going to expand to 20 acres of corn next spring," she said, "if the upper section takes the lime treatment as well as I expect." "It will," he said. "That's more than I can manage alone," she said. "I'd need to hire someone." "There are reliable hands available in the spring," he said. "I can give you names." "I was also thinking," she said, and then she paused, not because she was uncertain but because she was choosing her words with care, "about other kinds of arrangements." He turned and looked at her. The stars were very bright and his face was clear and direct in the cold air, and she said, with the same straightforward honesty she brought to everything, "I am in love with you, Phineas. I've known it for a while. I wanted to say it plainly because I think plain speaking is the right approach with you." He was looking at her with an expression that was unlike any she had seen on him before, open and direct and full of something that was not restrained at all. "Theodora," he said, "I have been in love with you since about the 3rd week of May, when I watched you pull 40 corn seedlings and replant them in different rows without complaint, because it was the right thing to do for the crop." A pause. "I didn't say anything because I didn't know how much time you needed and I wasn't willing to press you." She looked at him for a moment. "3 weeks into knowing me," she said. "You'd been farming alone for a month on land the bank called worthless," he said. "You were working 15 hours a day. You were entirely certain and entirely right." He shook his head very slightly. "It wasn't a difficult thing to feel." She reached out and took hold of the lapel of his coat, not pulling him, just holding it, and looked up at him in the starlight. He leaned down and kissed her, careful and certain, with both hands coming up to hold her face as though she were something he had been thinking about holding for a very long time. She kissed him back with the wholeness of a woman who had made a deliberate decision and was entirely at peace with it. When they separated, they stood in the cold with their foreheads nearly touching, and she said, "I think Emmett Marsh is going to consider himself very insightful." He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him, low and quiet and genuinely amused. "He will be insufferable about it," he agreed. She kept hold of his coat lapel. "I want to ask you something seriously." "Go ahead." "If we were to move toward the kind of arrangement I think we're moving toward," she said, "I want to be clear that the 40 acres is mine. It will always be mine. I intend to expand the farming operation and make it profitable on its own terms, and I would want that to be respected as a separate and equal enterprise." He looked at her steadily. "I would not have it any other way," he said. "The 40 acres is yours. What you grow there is yours. Any arrangement between us is a partnership of two independent people." "You mean that?" "Every word," he said. She believed him, and the believing was effortless, which was its own kind of answer. "Then I think we should have a very serious conversation about the future," she said. "I think we should," he said. "Maybe inside where it's warm." She laughed and let go of his coat and opened the fence gate, which she had never done before, and he walked through it, and she closed it behind him, and they walked to her house together in the starlit cold. The winter passed with a different quality than the previous one. The previous winter, Theodora's first alone after Robert's death, had been a gray and isolating thing, the short days and long nights filled with practical tasks and quiet grief. This winter was different. It was still cold and work-filled, and the land was still and gray between snowfalls, but there was warmth in it. Phineas came to dinner on Sundays, and she went to his house on Saturdays, and the line between their properties was crossed so regularly by both of them that it ceased to feel like a boundary at all. She met his cattle properly this winter, walking the herd with him in the mornings, and she found that she liked cattle more than she had expected to. There was something companionable about them, large and slow and present in the early morning cold. He was good with them, unhurried and attentive, and watching a person with their animals told you something about them that nothing else quite replicated. He helped her plan the expanded spring planting, spreading a map of the 40 acres on his kitchen table one evening, and working through the soil amendment plan for the upper section with the focused collaboration that she had come to understand was his version of intimacy, bringing his full intelligence to bear on something she cared about. They were also working through the future in direct conversation, as she had said they would on the night at the fence. He had asked her to marry him in December, on a Sunday evening at her kitchen table with the lamplight and the coffee cups between them, asking in the simple plain way that suited them both, not on his knees and not with florid language, but with a directness that said, "This is the thing I want, and I am asking you clearly because you deserve clarity." She had said yes with the same plainness. They agreed on a spring wedding, after the planting was in, but before the growing season reached its labor-intensive peak. They planned to speak to the minister at the Presbyterian Church in Cimarron, and to have it simple, with the Marsh brothers as witnesses and perhaps a few of the neighbors who had been watching Theodora's corn experiment with growing respect. Theodora wrote to her sister Clara in Missouri and told her about the marriage. Clara's response, which arrived in February on a mail coach from Raton, was joyful and warm, and included a long passage about how glad she was that Theodora had found a good man, and another passage that made Theodora laugh about how she had always known her sister was too stubborn and smart to let a bank have the last word on anything. She also wrote a brief, entirely civil letter to the First Territorial Bank of Colfax County, addressed to Harlan Bess, informing him of the results of the 1878 corn harvest and the planned expansion for 1879. She did not gloat. She simply reported, in the manner of one businessperson to another, the yield per acre and the prices achieved, and noted that she looked forward to continued agricultural development of the property. She did not mention his laughter in his office or his fraudulent tax lien. The certified letter from Valdez and the territorial inspector's inquiry spoke to those matters quite sufficiently without her adding to them. She showed the letter to Phineas before sending it. He read it and handed it back and said, "Precisely right. which was exactly what she had hoped he would say. The territorial inspector's inquiry into the First Territorial Bank concluded in late February with a formal censure and a requirement that the bank make restitution to 2 other families who had lost properties to similar fraudulent liens, in addition to substantial fines. Harlan Bess was removed from his position as bank president, and the bank was placed under temporary receivership. Thomas Harker, the county clerk, resigned from his position and left Colfax County. Clifton, the clerk who had delivered the foreclosure notice, was not penalized, having eventually cooperated with the inspector's inquiry by providing documentation. He later took a position at a dry goods store in Cimarron, which suited his temperament better. These events reached Theodora through the Cimarron newspaper and through the natural flow of community information that passes through small western towns in the 1870s. And when she read about the bank's censure and Bess's removal, she felt a satisfaction that was clean and uncomplicated. The same satisfaction she felt when a straight row came up true and even. The spring of 1879 came in warmly, the snowmelt from the mountains feeding the seasonal creek in good volume and the soil on the lower section, worked and fed through the winter, ready and responsive under the plow. She began planting in mid-April, 2 weeks after the last frost, working the lower 12 acres first in the tried north-south rows, and then moving to the amended upper section for the first test plantings on what had been alkaline ground. The lime treatment had worked. The upper soil was dramatically different from the previous spring, darker and more yielding, and when she ran the test rows through it, the seed went in clean and true. She had hired a farmhand for the season, a young man named Samuel Bright who was 19 and from a farming family in Colorado and who knew his business and was honest about what he didn't know, which Theodora considered the most important qualification for any new hire. She had also, without fanfare, gone back to the bank in Cimarron. The new acting manager, a younger man named Pierce who had come down from Taos under the territorial receivership, had listened to her describe her operation and her plans, and had approved an operating loan of $40 at reasonable terms, which she accepted because she had learned the value of operating capital, and because Pierce was a straightforward man who looked at numbers rather than at gender or widow status when he evaluated a loan. The wedding was on the second Saturday in May, the same time of year the corn had first gone in the ground, which Theodora privately considered right. The minister at the Presbyterian Church in Cimarron was a decent man named Reverend Holt, who did not add unnecessary ornamentation to the ceremony, which they had asked him not to. Cal and Emmett Marsh stood as witnesses. 6 neighbors attended, including Sebastiano Vargas and his wife, who brought a small jar of wild honey as a gift, and the Missouri family from east of Cimarron who had bought 10 bushels of bloody butcher corn, and one of the women from the church circle who had been quietly supportive of Theodora through the previous year's difficulties. Theodora wore the dark wool dress with the ivory collar, the same one she had worn to the bank and to her first wedding, because it was her best dress, and she was not a woman who believed in buying new things for ceremony when perfectly good things already existed. She had a small bunch of early wildflowers from the ridge, purple and yellow, tucked into the collar. Phineas wore his good jacket and a clean white shirt and his hat, which she had told him he did not have to remove during the ceremony if he didn't want to, and which he removed anyway. He looked at her throughout the ceremony with the full direct attention he gave to everything he considered important, and when Reverend Holt pronounced them married and Phineas kissed her, it was the same careful and certain kiss as the first one, and she kissed him back the same way. Emmett Marsh wept, which nobody had expected. Cal handed him a handkerchief with the expression of a man who was not going to admit he also needed one. The wedding supper was at Phineas's house, the larger of the 2 structures, with a table borrowed from the church set up in the main room, and food that Theodora had spent 2 days preparing with help from Mrs. Vargas, who was an excellent cook and had added several dishes of her own that improved the overall table considerably. There was venison roast and corn bread, and 2 kinds of preserved vegetables, and a dried apple cake, and the wild honey from the Vargases on fresh bread. They danced in the yard afterward, not formally, just to the music that Cal Marsh produced from a fiddle he had brought, hymns and a few popular tunes, and Sebastiano Vargas turned out to have a strong, clear voice that filled the yard under the May stars. Theodora danced with Phineas in the outdoor firelight with a looseness and pleasure she had not associated with dancing in a long time, and he was a better dancer than she expected, which she told him, and he said he had learned at a community barn dance in Kansas 20 years prior and had retained the information. When the guests had gone home and the yard was quiet, they stood together at the edge of Theodora's cornfield, which was showing its first new shoots of the season, small green spears pushing up through the prepared soil in the moonlight. "Here we are," she said. "Here we are," he agreed, his arm around her shoulders and her head against his jaw. The 40 acres lay before them in the spring night, real and alive and entirely hers, now theirs, though the precise accounting of ownership had been worked out carefully and correctly. The 40 acres legally hers, the 320 legally his, the 2 of them equal partners in the joint enterprise of working both. "Next year I want to try a portion of the upper section for winter wheat," she said. "I read about a wheat variety out of Colorado that's been developed for altitude," he said. "I'll write to the Agricultural Extension. Colorado," she said, "where Samuel Bright is from. I'll ask him." She laughed quietly and he pressed his lips to her hair. Summer came again with its heat and its afternoon storms and its long gold evenings. And this summer was fuller and louder than the last because 2 people were building a common life, and there was a great deal of practical and logistical content to be navigated alongside the emotional one. They were both specific people with specific habits and specific ideas about how things ought to work, and the navigation required genuine effort and genuine goodwill, and both of them brought it. There were disagreements about the management of the shared fence line, about the proper winter storage method for seed corn, about a decision he made about his cattle schedule without consulting her that affected her irrigation timing. The disagreements were direct and honest and resolved with the same directness and honesty, because they had established early that plain speaking was the mode they lived in, and neither of them was interested in festering silences. She had her crop to tend, and he had his cattle to tend, and Samuel Bright turned out to be a genuinely capable farmhand, who expanded the upper section planting with a confidence and competence that freed Theodora to also participate in some of the cattle operations, which she found she liked more than she had anticipated. She had good instincts with animals, Phineas told her, and she thought he was probably right. The 1879 harvest was more than twice the 1878 harvest. The 12 lower acres produced their reliable strong yield, and the upper section, in its first productive year, added a meaningful amount on top of that. Samuel Bright brought in the crop with the focused efficiency of a young man who understood that this was a harvest that mattered beyond its numbers, and when Theodora tallied the final yield and the final sales at the kitchen table in early October, she sat back and looked at the numbers for a long time. Phineas came and sat across from her and looked at the paper with the numbers. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she said. The land that the bank had called worthless had, in its second productive year, yielded a profit of $53 after operating costs. Not a fortune, but proof, in the clearest possible terms, of everything that Harlan Bess had failed to understand about the land, about farming, and about Theodora Grayson. She wrote to her sister Clara with the numbers, and Clara wrote back with exclamation and pride, and a letter that arrived the following week saying she was planning to visit in the spring, which Theodora received with equal parts excitement and practical planning. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the most contented winter Theodora had known since childhood. There was a quality to it she had not anticipated, a comfort that came from being known thoroughly by the person you shared your evenings with, and from knowing them equally well. Phineas read beside the fire on winter evenings, and she did her accounts or her mending or her reading alongside him, and the quiet between them was the warm kind, the kind that two people build together like a structure against the cold. She had suspected by December that she was expecting their first child. She had said nothing until January, wanting to be certain, and when she was certain she told him on a Sunday morning over coffee with the direct simplicity that characterized her important announcements. He had looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before and would spend the rest of her life being glad she had seen. It was the expression of a man who had not expected joy of that specific character to arrive in his life and was encountering it now with a kind of careful reverence. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I have a constitution built for this kind of work." He pressed his forehead against her hands, still holding them, and she felt the exhale of something long held finally released. The baby came in September of 1880, a boy, born with a quality of deliberate patience that seemed to come directly from his father. They named him Robert Phineas Turner, Robert for the man who had brought Theodora to this land and given her the foundation on which everything else was built, and Phineas for the man who had believed in the land and in her when the bank had dismissed them both. Clara was present for the birth, having arrived in the spring as promised and stayed through the summer because she was, as it turned out, not inclined to leave once she had seen the life her sister had made. She was 2 years younger than Theodora, dark-haired and quick-tempered and funny, and she had arrived with a trunk full of practical things and immediately made herself useful in ways that nobody had asked her to, which was the family way. Emmett Marsh, who had wept at the wedding, was entirely overrun by Clara's arrival and spent the better part of 6 months finding elaborate reasons to be near Theodora's property at times when he knew Clara would be present. Cal Marsh found this highly entertaining and said nothing. Robert Phineas Turner came into the world on a warm September morning with the harvest almost ready, which seemed appropriate to everyone. Phineas held his son in the spare room of their house, the house they had decided to use as their primary home because it was larger, and because Theodora's 40 acres was better managed from there anyway, the 40 acres being well within easy walking distance, and his expression as he looked at the infant was the same quiet, full expression he turned on important things, and Theodora, tired and warm in the bed, watched him and felt something she had no adequate words for. "He has your eyes," Phineas said. "He has your forehead," she said. "Is that a compliment?" "It is," she said. "Your forehead is one of your better features." He looked at her over the infant, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen from him before, and she thought that, for a man of limited visible emotion, he was remarkably readable to her now, and she expected that would only deepen. Clara rode back to Missouri in October with a letter in her pocket from Emmett Marsh, because Emmett Marsh had finally organized himself sufficiently to write down what he had been communicating through extended proximity and fidgeting for 6 months, which Cal considered the best entertainment he had witnessed in years. Theodora read the letter before it was sent, not because Emmett asked her to, but because he appeared at her door looking so anxious that she offered, and she told him it was honest and said what it meant, and that her sister would appreciate it, which proved correct. The 1880 harvest was the third and the best, the upper section fully productive now, and the lower 12 acres performing with the reliability of established ground. Theodora's corn from the Cimarron Flats, which had been called worthless by a bank and proved real by a woman's knowledge and a quiet rancher's belief, was beginning to be known in the trading posts and mills of the region. The bloody butcher variety she had chosen for its resilience had become, through 3 years of careful seed selection, a strain particularly adapted to the altitude and soil of her specific 40 acres. She was asked to write about her methods for a new agricultural pamphlet being produced by the New Mexico Territorial Farming Cooperative, a development that she found satisfying in an exact and specific way. She wrote about soil amendment for alkaline land, about dry farming techniques, about north-south row alignment on a slope, about the Bloody Butcher variety's drought tolerance, and the right conditions for its particular success. She wrote clearly and practically, the way she did everything. Phineas read the draft of the pamphlet beside the fire one evening with young Robert asleep in the wooden cradle he had built in the winter, and when he finished he looked up and said, "This is good, clear and exact and useful." "It's what I know," she said. "It's what you worked out," he said, "through your own knowledge on ground that people said couldn't grow anything." She looked at the sleeping baby, and then at her husband, and then out the window at the November dark that covered the 40 acres. The land that the bank had called worthless. The land she had planted with her own money and her own work and her own knowledge and her own refusal to accept someone else's assessment of what was possible. It was always good land, she said. It just needed someone who understood what it wanted. By the spring of 1881, Clara wrote to say she was marrying Emmett Marsh and would be returning to New Mexico, which caused Theodora to laugh for several minutes and Phineas to say he hoped Cal was prepared for his brother's permanent elation. Clara and Emmett married in June, a cheerful and informal affair held at the Turner property with a great deal of food and music from Cal's fiddle, and Emmett spent the reception looking at his new wife with an expression of dazed happiness that made everyone who saw it feel generous about the world. The two families became a kind of extended community on the edge of the Cimarron Flats. The Turner Ranch and the Grayson Turner Farm and the Marsh Brothers' small property they took on together the following year. And between them, they had the kind of interdependent and respected community that made life in the territory genuinely sustainable and genuinely good. Robert grew into a boy who had his father's solidity and his mother's curiosity, and who loved the corn field with a passion that Theodora found both moving and practical. By the time he was old enough to walk the rows with her, he was asking questions about soil and water, and seed that she answered with the same directness she brought to everything, because she believed that children who are spoken to honestly about real things become people who understand real things. In the autumn of 1882, Theodora went back to the bank. Not the First Territorial Bank of Colfax County, which had been restructured and was now operating under legitimate management, but the bank itself, the physical building, the room where she had sat across from Harlan Bess in the dark wool dress and listened to him laugh. The new manager, a man named Garrett who had come from Albuquerque, was capable and respectful and had approved 2 previous loans for her without incident. She was not going to him today for a loan. She was going to deposit the earnings from the 1882 harvest, which was her best year yet, and to speak to him about the possibility of purchasing the adjacent 12 acres to the east, which had recently come up for sale. She sat across from Garrett at the same desk where Bess had once sat, in the same chair she had sat in 4 years earlier, and she placed her numbers on the desk with the same folded hands and the same clear eyes, and the difference was so complete that it was almost mathematical. She walked out of the bank into the New Mexico sunlight afterward, the same white October sunlight as 4 years before, and she stood on the same plank sidewalk, and she breathed in the same manner. But everything else was different, and she knew it fully. Phineas was waiting on the street with the wagon, Robert between his feet on the bench playing with a smooth stone he had found, and Theodora climbed up and settled beside her husband, and he looked at her expression and understood it without her speaking. "The 12 acres," he said. "Approved," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they drove home through the October afternoon, the mountains going golden and blue to the east, and the land spreading wide and clean in all directions. And she thought about the first drive to Cimarron on a borrowed mule, with a map pressed against her chest, and a banker's laughter ringing in her ears. She thought about the first stake in the cracked red earth, the first corn shoots in the morning light, the sluice gate and the certified letter and the night at the fence under the stars. She thought about a man who had said that land was rarely worthless if you understood what it wanted, and who had meant several things at once when he said it. The 40 acres was 52 acres now. The corn came up every spring in straight north-south rows, and the creek ran through the lower field in good years, and the irrigation channel supplemented it in dry ones, and the Bloody Butcher variety had developed over 4 years into something specific and local and strong. She was 38 years old, and she had a husband who read beside her in the evenings, and a son who asked good questions, and a sister who lived near enough to come to dinner on Wednesday evenings, and a farm that had been built from ground the bank said was worthless. In the spring of 1883, their second child came, another boy they named Jacob, who arrived with a different temperament entirely, louder and more immediately opinionated than his older brother, which Phineas observed with the expression of a man who found this both surprising and not particularly surprising. Robert was 3 and already convinced that his primary purpose in life was to help his mother walk the corn rows, and he did this with a seriousness that made Emmett Marsh say to his wife Clara that the boy was going to be a farmer greater than his mother, which Clara considered accurate and said so, and Theodora, overhearing, said she hoped he would exceed her in every possible way, which was the sincere hope of every farmer for the land they would one day pass on. The 52 acres continued to grow in the way that well-tended land grows, not quickly or dramatically, but surely, each season building on the last, the soil improving with every worked-in amendment, the yields becoming the reliable and respectable yields of established farmland. She kept the pamphlet she had written in her cedar box alongside Robert's death certificate and the surveyor's map, and the certified letter from Valdez and Harlan Bess's foreclosure notice, all together in the order of her particular history. She did not keep the foreclosure notice as a wound. She kept it as evidence, the way a person keeps a record of the conditions they worked under, because it explains the achievement. One evening in the late summer, when the corn was in its final days before harvest and the stalks were tall and dense and green, and the whole field had the full, warm smell of a good crop ready to come in, she was standing at the edge of the upper section when Phineas came and stood beside her. The boys were in bed. The evening was warm and still. Behind them the mountains held the last color of sunset. "I was thinking about the first summer," she said. "The re-rowing," he said. "Yes, and the sulfur, and the sluice gate, and the bread and salt pork," she smiled. "You were very patient with me. I was very interested in you," he said. Patience was easy. She leaned against his shoulder. His arm came around her, the same sure arm, and they stood and looked at the corn in the last of the light. "The bank said it was worthless," she said, and the word had lost its sting entirely and was now simply the beginning of a story that had a very different ending from the one the bank had intended. "The bank was wrong," he said. "You believed it could grow something," she said. "I believed you could grow something," he said. "The land was just the place where that happened." She turned and looked at him with the full attention she gave to things she wanted to remember precisely, the shape of his face in the last light, the certainty in his voice, the way he said things that meant exactly what they meant and nothing more and nothing less. "You've been telling me that since the beginning," she said. "I'll keep telling you," he said. She kissed him in the evening air with the corn standing tall around them and the mountains behind them and the stars beginning to appear, one by one, in the deepening sky above the Cimarron Flats. The 52 acres were alive and productive and entirely real. The boys would grow up on this land and learn its particular requirements and inherit its particular history, the story of a widow and a banker's laughter and a man at a fence line, and a first crop that had no business succeeding on ground that everyone said was worthless, except that it had, because the woman who planted it had known something the bank didn't know, and the quiet rancher next door had known it too. And together They had made something true and lasting from the red earth of the Cimarron Flats. Jacob learned to walk the following spring, unsteady and determined, moving through the kitchen toward the door with his arms out for balance, and Robert held one of his brother's hands and led him toward the light coming in from outside, and Theodora watched from the table with Phineas beside her and the coffee between them, and thought that this was what it looked like when things grew the way they were supposed to grow. Patient and real and rooted deep, in ground that someone had believed in when no one else would.